This is Seymour Rocks reporting from Down Under. Uh, I've just spent quite a long time listening to George Galloway's mother of all radio shows, and he had a very interesting interview on Hong Kong, which I really recommend that people listen to. There's a lot to think about there. Because I don't know very much. I've never been to Hong Kong and I haven't been to China. I've been to other parts of Asia. So, yeah, there was one particular segment that I wanted to share because I missed out on all the early discussion about the extradition bill. It didn't kind of interest me that much at the time, and it was only when these demonstrations became very large and very violent that I started to pay attention to. So this was very, very interesting revelation for me. So I really wanted to share it with you now.
Proximate cause of the first demonstrations has already been iced, will not be implemented, and in any case related to the right of the people in Taiwan to extradite a sex offender and murderer who had taken refuge in Hong Kong, who could not be extradited either to the Chinese mainland or to Taiwan. And so there is a rapist and murderer at large in Hong Kong who couldn't be sent to face justice. In any case, this extradition treaty is now way down the list of demands, way down the batting order of the protesters' demands, isn't it? And do they have any legitimate demands?
Thanks, George. Yeah, I think it's probably worth touching upon the extradition treaty because it was allegedly the main concern. So the main concern, we're told, is that Hong Kong has this vibrant history of democracy, which it doesn't, but we've discussed that already, and that people would suddenly be at threat of being taken from this vibrant democracy, Hong Kong, to this totalitarian dictatorship, China, where they would be subject to the will of the courts, which are beyond any kind of reason, and would obviously victimize them. This is the narrative. The reality is, of course, Hong Kong is part of China, that they've, for 50 years, they've absolutely agreed to maintain a system where they're one country, but they have two systems. So the capitalist system, the banking system of Hong Kong will go unthreatened, unchallenged, and nothing has been done by China to violate that in any way. As you quite rightly say, there was and I've been to Hong Kong, my wife is from Hong Kong, my children are learning Cantonese in Greenwich, and if you go from Greenwich to the Cutty Sark, you can actually see a lot of this history actually about Hong Kong and India written there. So I mean, this is not alien to the people of Britain. We know it very well. But in terms of that extradition treaty, you're quite right. There was a young man who took his young pregnant girlfriend to Taiwan. They had an argument there. He ended up strangling her to death, along with her unborn child. Put them inside. He then, you would imagine, would shop himself, but he didn't. He didn't turn himself in. He didn't feel apparently the shame that you or I might feel if we'd committed such an act and reckon and deal with it. He stuffed her into a suitcase, George. He stuffed her into a suitcase, took her onto the metro and dumped her in Taiwan. He then promptly returned to Hong Kong. Now, because of the unusual colonial law of Hong Kong, they couldn't try him for any crime that's not been committed on Hong Kong. And it was the Taiwanese government who wanted to extradite him to face justice for his very heinous crime. And it was in that context that Carrie Lam, who's the
chief
executive in Hong Kong, was promoting this motion in order to set up an extradition treaty so that actually people who commit crimes in Hong Kong can be extradited elsewhere in the world. And among the countries would be mainland China, of which, you know, ironically, because it's one country, two systems, people can't currently be extradited. But if you think about it, with the current business climate, there are criminal elements who seek refuge from Beijing and from China by trying to flee to Hong Kong. So it's perfectly reasonable that people face judgment for their crimes.
Sure. I decided to check the story as told here and found this article here from the South China Morning Post. Hong Kong man wanted in Taiwan murder case could escape extradition after pleading guilty to money laundering charges. Legal experts say Chan could escape extradition if he walks free of a money laundering sentence before the new fugitive bill has passed. Well, as we know, the fugitive bill was the proximate cause of these protests in Hong Kong, and then the Hong Kong government actually backed down. So what this article says is it confirms that Hong Kong people cannot, under something that's inherited from the old system, under the British, be tried for crimes committed elsewhere. And Taiwan wants to extradite someone who has committed a heinous murder in their country. But all of this is painted in the international media as an affront to Hong Kong democracy. So if there are, we're told, that it's an affront to one country, two systems, and to democracy in Hong Kong. Well, there are several things that come out of this. Two things are true, that Hong Kong is an integral part of China, always has been, even though it's spent 150 years under British colonial rule, and also that Hong Kong has never been a Western-style democracy, and certainly not under the British, where a small Chinese elite had certain privileges while the Chinese working majority had none. And I've seen photographs from, I think, 1956 with British police using guns to gun down rioters in Hong Kong back then. So, what do you say about that? Hong Kong was ruled from London, and it had an appointed governor, just like they have an appointed chief executive now from China, Carrie Lam. And then another point that's made is about the lack of independence of the judiciary system. That's true, of course, but they also criticise China because it has an almost 100% conviction rate. Also true. But then I remembered something about Japan. Now, Japan has a 99% conviction rate, and it's based on confession. And yet who is pointing the finger at Japan? Nobody. But it's China. China is a communist tyranny, probably since last year, I suspect. It was all swept under the carpet before then. And yet there's an article which I'll post, which points out that the social situation in China, where the individual is at the bottom of the pecking order and the state, the collective, is at the top. And this article was saying that this is due as much to traditional Confucianism as it is to communism. So just as a couple of reflections in conclusion, as desirable as the principle of open democracy, and you tell me where it's practiced in 2019, I question how a large country with a huge population of over 1 billion can be ruled along Western lines. It seems to me to be a recipe for chaos, which in this case I think that's what the aim is with these violent protests. And chaos is the one thing that the Chinese fear above everything else. They've had more than their fill of chaos. So I think there's lots to reflect on there, and I think reflection is what we should be doing, not just having a sort of instant judgments based on our own prejudices. Certainly an invitation to try and enter the heads of different people and a different way of thinking. So that's me from down under Seymour Rocks.